Finally, we make it past the negative tiers and make it into the indifference tiers. What an upgrade. Just like with the previous tiers, I'll briefly explain what my criteria for the tier is. The OK tier is filled with what I consider to be OK fights, obviously. What I define as an OK fight are fights that don't really have anything special going for them, but they don't really have anything wrong with them either. As you see when we get into the tier, a lot of the bosses are the early game fights in each respective game, being decent bosses for new players who are starting out, but fall short when compared to more complex late game bosses. Also sadly, I'll have to scrap my bar chart that I've been using as it isn't really all that applicable anymore, but I'm sure you'll manage with that. Now, with that out of the way, let's actually get into the tier. The last giant might be the weakest first boss in the Soul series, but I still don't think he's a bad boss. His moveset is simple, but still punishing if you do get hit. He teaches you about how and when to properly use the lock-on. He also has a mini phase shift in the middle of the fight, showing you that this is something that will also be happening later on. I think he is overall the weakest first boss in this series as he's too simple. It takes way too long to actually get to him, so he ends up being far too weak compared to you. This is further exacerbated by putting the Pursuer right afterwards, who's significantly harder. This is made even more disappointing when Dark Souls 1 already had two fantastic first bosses that played off each other really well. All in all, he's a fight that would have benefited greatly from being a tiny bit earlier in the game, but he is still a pretty solid first boss compared to most other games. On his own, I think the Taurus Demon is fairly good for new players and is a very nice reincorporation of the previous mechanics taught to the player, like plunging attacks. His moveset is fairly simple and is similar to the Asylum Demon, but just that bit harder to make you feel like you're improving at the game when you finally beat him. The main downsides holding back the fight from being higher on the list is that I think he might be a bit too easy. I think that they might have wanted to put him a bit later and make him a bit harder so he doesn't feel quite as much of a copy-paste from the Asylum Demon as he currently does. He does also have a fair amount of weird bugs and glitches, most of which will result in either you or the ball being out of the arena. But overall, Taurus Demon is a pretty good first boss. It's okay tier it is. The Gaping Dragon is like the tutorial fight for dragons. I don't think this was what it was intended to be, but it just kinda ended up this way from being an early game dragon fight. It has a lot of trademarks of dragon bosses such as breath attacks and a charge attack. You even fight him somewhat similarly where you just kinda lay into one of his legs, though he does crawl in his stomach so you're not under him, something I think helps a lot with visibility of his attacks. There is also the Chandler that is on the balcony over the fight, who punishes you if you don't kill him by shooting at you and occasionally buffing the boss itself. This is one of the few times in the entire series there are elements that affect the fight that aren't in the arena itself, something I honestly like, or at least I think it was done well in this fight. I do have some gripes with the fight though, or well, mainly two gripes. Gaping Dragon likes to ever so slightly turn a lot, which will result in you taking a little bit of damage and getting staggered. On its own, this isn't all that bad, but when it happens as often as it does during the fight, it becomes tedious very quickly. Last thing is something that is really common with a lot of dragons, and that is our previously mentioned rush move. The fact that they have a move to rush forwards, creating distance between you and the dragon, isn't really a problem. The problem is that the attack has no startup animation, making it impossible to dodge. It honestly isn't that big of a deal, but any undodgeable attack is bad, so I thought I'd mention it. I'm just going to come out and say it. This is by far the most biased fight I rated, where I rated mostly on how I feel about the boss and conveniently ignoring the fight itself. As when it comes to the fight, Gwyndolin is extremely simple. He has a total of 3 attacks, none of them being particularly interesting or hard to dodge. Where Gwyndolin really shines is in lore, design, and build-up. I'm not going to go into detail about his lore, I'll leave that up to you if you're interested, and I would strongly recommend that you look it up if you don't know about it. The parts I will talk about is the fact that Gwyndolin probably has one of the most interesting arenas in the entire series, despite it just being a hallway. The fact that it loops infinitely, yes I do know that it isn't actually infinite, and how his attacks are designed with the arena in mind is really cool. There is also the fact that he is the only Covenant leader with an actual boss fight, which is also really cool. So yeah, the actual fight is extremely lackluster, but everything else is done so well that I still regard it as an okay fight overall. And if you have a problem with that, fight me. This was honestly a fight I struggled a fair bit with placing. The Iron Golem is another gimmick fight. His gimmick being that once you hit him enough in one leg, he'll fall down. What FromSoft intended to happen was for him to fall off the arena, one-shotting him, but this very rarely actually plays out this way. What will happen most of the time is that you try to knock him off the edge, but he'll just bug and do some wild shit like he did in my playthrough, just casually floating in the air with not a care in the world. Gimmick aside, the fight itself is not all that bad. Just beating his legs until he dies doesn't take that long and is a very viable way of killing him. Like the Gaping Dragon, the Iron Golem also has an enemy outside the arena that affects the fight itself, further reinforcing the idea that you should explore around the boss before challenging them. Though even ignoring the bugs revolving around his gimmick, he still has plenty of bugs. the most frustrating of which are related to his grab attack. This grab attack can hit you basically no matter where you are in your role or in the arena. And just if that's not bad enough, if you do get grabbed, you'll most likely die since he loves to throw you out of the arena. There are also a bunch of minor bugs, but I won't be going into them here. All in all, Iron Golem is a gimmick fight which doesn't really use his own gimmick, but somehow manages to end up being okay. And honestly, I'm not complaining. And finally we get to the second use of the Asylum Demon, even though we still haven't even talked about the original fight. It is pretty hard talking about this fight without having talked about the first Asylum Demon fight, so I'm just going to go off the assumption that you have fought the Asylum Demon yourself. So, this is probably going to sound a bit weird seeing how Demon Firesage is lower on the list than Asylum Demon, but I personally think that Demon Firesage is a better boss. This mostly comes from the fact that the Demon Firesage is much later in the game and therefore have a lot more added to it. But why I think Asylum Demon is overall better is going to be explained when I actually finally talk about him. So I guess you just have to keep watching to find out. I do think that the few attacks that were added did improve this fight, but at the same time it is dragged down by the fact that this is the third time you fight this boss. Because of the Stray Demon, the Demon Firesage just feels like another rehash and doesn't really do enough to differentiate itself from the two other fights. All in all, Demon Firesage is a very decent fight, but is dragged down by being a rehash of a rehash. Yet another fight I had a problem with ranking. Divine Dragon doesn't even really feel like a fight. It feels like one of those set pieces you see in Call of Duty campaigns. Okay, that might be a bit of a stretch, but I do hope you can see where I'm coming from. The Divine Dragon fight doesn't really feel like it is here because it is a fight, it's more of a spectacle that the player is taking part in. And I have to admit, it is pretty fucking dope. Jumping high in the air, catching lightning and sending it back, everything just makes you feel like a complete badass, and I do like those aspects of the fight. I only start having problems with it when rating it as a fight, since it isn't what you would traditionally call a fight in the Soul series. So in the end, my solution was to just place it in the middle of the list. It's not bad, it's not good, but it is a real spectacle. After having just done a fight I had a hard time placing, now we move on to one I found really easy to place. Sanctuary Guardian is what I like to call a filler boss. There's basically no lore on this guy, no build up, he's just kinda there at the very start of the DLC. His moveset is fairly challenging, but not so hard that you won't kill him on your first or second try. Overall, he's a decent boss, but at the same time, most likely that one boss that you always forget about when talking about Souls bosses, which is why I place him in the middle of the OK tier. From an actual filler boss to one that just feels like one, despite being one of the 4 Lord Souls in Dark Souls 2. The Rotten is hard to talk about for the same reason he isn't that good of a boss. There's absolutely no substance to his fight. He's one of the 4 Lord Souls, but they still only gave him 3 to 4 moves, all of which are just him swinging his cleaver. That's it. He just stands there and swings at you. All of his attacks are really slow, though to be fair, they do pack a punch if you do somehow manage to get hit. There isn't really anything special about his arena, except for a few fire pits that don't really do anything. At the very least, he has a really easy run back, something that is rare for Dark Souls 2. Okay, so to be fair, this fight very easily could have been in Lackluster. It has basically no moves, its special mechanic barely has any impact on the overall fight, and it honestly is a bit of a pain in the ass to even start the fight. But goddamn, the boss mixed together with the visual of all the spirit animals as that absolute banger of a boss theme plays is honestly something quite special. I think it's my favorite track in the entire game, and it does some heavy lifting for this fight. Despite it being in the OK tier, I think the Curse Rod of Greatwood is one of the best executed gimmick fights in the entire series. Its unique mechanic where you have to hit it in its white pulse balls is for the most part good. There are times when it becomes frustrating, like when it places them into the ground so you can't hit them, but it doesn't happen that often. The ads at the start don't really affect the fight at all, since you'll just kill them all right at the start of the fight, and even if he misses a few, they'll die at the phase change anyways. Speaking of the phase change, it's also one of the better ones in the series. It is genuinely surprising the first time it happens. Other than some wonky hitboxes, this is one of the examples of a gimmick fight done right. Old Dragonslayer is one of the best examples of a boss that probably would be higher in the list if it was in a different game. The fight itself is quite good. He has a varied moveset with a lot of cool callbacks to the original Ornstein. He even starts the fight the same way as Ornstein does. The only reason I rate him as low as I do is because he's in Dark Souls 2. You might think this is unfair, and it probably is, but when the only problem with the fight I can think of are directly from the game and not the fight itself, it's just kinda how it works out. More specifically, the problem I have is that because you meet him so early, you're not going to have a lot of agility yet. This makes it so if you dodge him properly, he will still constantly be hitting you with glancing blows. Getting hit by a glancing blow in Dark Souls 2 is probably one of the most frustrating things in the entire game, because you know that if it was any other Souls game, you would have been fine as you dodged properly. So yeah. It is a shame that I end up rating him this low, but I don't really see a way around it. Finally, we get to wrap up the Lord Souls of Dark Souls 2, and we aren't even out of the OK tier yet. Yeesh. Lost Sinner, as with most other bosses in Dark Souls 2, isn't really a bad fight, it's just a really lackluster one. Here you are, about to face off with one of the strongest entities that you know of in the game at this point. You start building up a mental image of what this fight might be like, what kind of cool design and attacks they could have given them. And then you get to her, start the fight, and then immediately realize that she's yet another humanoid enemy with a sword who has 4 moves, all of which are just swinging her sword. The one saving grace being that she has at least a jump, so that's kinda cool. To be fair, she does have some extra mechanics where you can light the fires outside the arena to light up the boss fight, something that I do think is kinda cool, but overall it just doesn't add that much to the fight itself. And for the love of God, don't fight her in New Game Plus like I did to try and get the Chaos Blade, it makes the fight way worse. Don't really have much to say about this one. Much like the Sanctuary Guardian, Wolf of Radagon is another filler boss. Well, to be fair to him, he has done quite well. His mix of normal animal moveset and magic attacks is quite unique for this series and works really well. He's a boss that really likes to jump around a lot, but that includes jumping into melee range, so he isn't frustrating to fight as a melee. If anything, he's probably more frustrating as a range build for once. So yeah, good filler boss, good job FromSoft. Okay. So I understand that this might be a bit of a leap from Wolf of Radagon to Fortissax, but let me explain. Fortissax is a dragon boss, so is it really my fault? Okay, in all seriousness, I don't think Fortissax is a particularly good boss. He's yet another dragon boss that uses the exact same moveset as every other dragon in Elden Ring, except for one, but we'll get to him a bit later. He does have a few attacks where he uses lightning, but most of these just boils down to him slamming lightning into the ground and you having to watch out and jump over or roll through. He does have a unique mechanic where every now and then he'll place lightning on you, and after a set amount of time it will pop and do a lightning strike where you were standing when it popped. I don't really like this mechanic. It doesn't really achieve anything other than punish melee for being in melee range, as it will only apply to you if you're under him. I really wish FromSoft would come up with an interesting way of solving the fact that dragon fights just are not that good, instead of making up these arbitrary things that punish you for standing under dragons as you fight. As it stands, it just feels like I'm being punished for simply do what is the best strat for fighting against dragons as a melee. Four Kings is a fight with a lot of potential. Its unique mechanic of being a DPS check before it spawns another version of himself is good, as it encourages and rewards you for playing aggressively. Though FromSoft managed to screw it up just about as badly as they could have. See, Four Kings has 2 very major flaws. First, have you ever noticed that sometimes when you get hit by the Four Kings, he'll do basically no damage? Well, this is because Four Kings have 2 different hitboxes with this sword, one for the actual blade portion and one for the handle or his hand. If he hits you with the blade part, it will do full damage, but if he hits you with his hilt, he does about 1/10 of what he normally would. This makes it so if you hug him really hard, there is pretty much no way for you to die, as he can't do anything but chip away at your health bar. The second thing is that he has an attack that cannot be dodged no matter what as long as he casts it. Specifically, I'm talking about the attack where he throws a giant purple disc at you. For some reason, FromSoft decided this was going to be a completely unavoidable attack. Even if it hits you during your iframes, it will do full damage. I have no clue why they did this, but it's a pretty big no-no when it comes to a game like Dark Souls. Luckily, FromSoft never really does another attack like this in any of the future games, so that's good at least. And here we have a second attempt at a PvP boss. Well, in this list at least. And yet again, it kind of falls flat. First of all, the summoning mechanic for this boss never really worked at all. I've played through Dark Souls 2 5 or 6 times in total, several of which were at the launch of the game, and I think I only ever saw him summon another player a single time. That being said, I'm honestly glad that this doesn't work, as I find it to be the worst part of this fight. If it was just another PvP boss like in Demon Souls and in Dark Souls 3, then it would probably have been rated lower, next to Half-Life. The only reason it isn't is because the Looking Glass Knight himself is actually quite a good fight. Yes, he is another humanoid boss with a sword in Dark Souls 2, but at least he has a decent moveset. It is pretty slow, but it's readable. It's hard hitting when it hits and has enough magic moves to spice it up. He doesn't really have that many glancing blows issues as the other bosses, so there's that. Basically, if the fight had no summoning mechanic, he would be higher. If it had a more consistent one, then he would be lower. I think it's time for FromSoft to retire this gimmick and just make an actual decent PvP arena instead. The easiest way to sum up Aava is that she's just the Wolf of Radagon, but done better. She has a better mix of physical and magic attacks, making you actively think about both. I didn't personally find it to be a hard fight, but even then it was probably one of the fights that I enjoyed the most in the entire game, and I don't even usually like animal fights. The fight does end up being a bit slower paced, but that is inevitable when comparing a Dark Souls 2 fight to an Elden Ring fight. The fight is also enhanced if you happen to try and fight her before lifting the snowstorm. It makes for a cool reveal when you get to see what she actually looks like. That's about it. It's just a Wolf of Radagon, but better. Good job, B-Team. Overall, Sinh is a cool fight. he's probably one of the most quote-unquote realistic dragon fights. Fighting Sinh feels like you're fighting a proper dragon for once. He flies about and breathes fire that covers huge areas of the arena. He has a massive HP pool, most of his melee attacks are massive sweeping attacks that you have no choice but to roll. Fighting Sinh straight up just feels cool. For a lot of people at least. For me, he's kinda boring. Sinh commits what I'm quickly finding out is my cardinal sin of boss fights. He forces me to wait for extended periods of time. Despite being a dragon that has already been wounded, Sinh really likes to fly, and as a melee player there isn't really much for me to do when he's in the air. So I spend most of the time kinda just standing around waiting for him to finally come down, so I can get a few hits in before he inevitably decides that he's going to do another flight. The actual fighting parts of the fight are pretty good, just a shame that there aren't more of them. If Midir isn't my most controversial placement, then this is it. Either way, this is going to be another one where I'm going to have to defend my opinion, so let's get to it. Firstly, and probably most importantly, this fight is extremely buggy. I can't tell you the amount of times where Ornstein has gotten stuck on Smough while doing an attack, holding attack for 15 seconds and then just randomly getting unleashed on me from nowhere. Or Smough casually pushing Ornstein forwards with his hammer, making it so the attack that I just dodged now somehow hits. Or even times where one of them just straight up falls out of the arena. This has to be one of the most buggy fights in the entire game, if not the entire franchise. Don't worry though, because I do have some complaints about the actual fight as well. I admit, on paper this fight sounds pretty good. One slow dude who's big and a smaller dude who's quick. Sounds like the perfect recipe for a duo fight. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that they don't synergize at all. Other than their sizes, speed and lore, there isn't really anything to them that makes them feel like a duo. None of their attacks line up, no special mechanics between the two. Well, except for the face change, but that's in a cutscene so it hardly counts. Worst thing is, despite me saying several times that the sizes are a good idea, they didn't even manage to do that right. Smough is supposed to be the big and slow enemy, but is easily the most aggressive out of the two. He will constantly be running at you, doing his massive shoveling move. All the while Ornstein is just vibing in the back, considering the perfect time to go in as to get stuck on Smough as much as possible. At the very least, I do agree with others that this fight is fairly hard for your first time around, but I don't think this is because the boss is well designed, but exactly the opposite. I only think this fight is hard because it's really hard to get any hits in when they are constantly overlaying their attacks, leaving close to no openings. The only thing this fight tests is the player's patience. Amygdala is about as plain as a Bloodborne fight gets. There's not really anything interesting going on, it's pretty much just a beast fight. The fight is mainly carried by the fact that it's a Bloodborne fight, so its gameplay is top notch. The Amygdala also has a really interesting design that you get to see several times before you actually fight in, doing a great job of building up the fight. Other than this, there isn't really that much to say about it, it's just a really okay fight in what is otherwise a superb game. Essentially the first boss you fight in Sekiro, if you don't count the scripted fight against Kenichiro, and it's honestly a really weird choice. Usually for the first fight of the game, FromSoft starts with some bigger, slower bosses to ease the players into it. And while Gyoubu technically is larger than you, he is also the only mounted boss that you will fight in the entire game. Other than this, he essentially works the same as any other first boss. A fairly basic moveset consisting of mostly slow attacks that are easy to react to, though I do think he has a few problems with his moveset. He's fine when you're at a medium distance from him, but if you end up hugging him, he has several extremely fast attacks that are genuinely hard to react to, even for veterans. He has an attack where he runs around on his horse before charging again. While he does this, you have an opportunity to grapple towards him and get a couple of hits in while he's in the air. This however, for some reason will most likely end with him just hitting you while you're locked in the flying animation. I don't really get this. Why give you the option to grapple him at all if it's going to end up you getting hit? What this does is signal to the player that using grapple mechanics to bosses is useless, something they did to me, as I never really used grapple mechanics in any of the boss fights. Other than these minor problems, he's a very solid first boss. Probably the third best one they've done, and funnily enough, second best is the next boss on the list, so let's not waste any more time here. Finally, we get to the long-awaited Asylum Demon. And the worst part is, there isn't even that much to say about the Asylum Demon. But to be fair to the big guy, this is partly why I think he is so good. As the first boss to what was most people's introductions to the Soul series, he's fairly perfect. Big dude with slow attacks, does decent damage, but not too much. And he's extremely intimidated looking, giving you that extra dopamine rush when you do take him down. Even though I don't think he's the best first boss they've made, I do think he's the best first boss they could have made for this game. Okay, so the placement for the Bella Gargoyles might be a bit misleading compared to how I actually feel about them. They're a classic example of a fight I think is genuinely really good, but I find it hard to rate any higher than this purely because it's an early game fight, making it hard for it to stand up against boss fights that are a bit later in the game. That being said, I genuinely think the Gargoyles is one of the best duo fights I've ever done. Starting off the fight with only one Gargoyle is clever as it doesn't immediately overwhelm the player with 2 enemies charging them. The fact that the second one only appears after the first one drops to half HP makes it so that rushing it down is a lot more doable. Gargoyles is also a great example of a duo fight where the 2 bosses actually have some synergy, as one will mainly focus on melee and the other one on range attacks. This makes the fight a lot easier to control and makes overlapping attacks a lot rarer, but still requires the player to position the bosses properly to create openings. If more duo fights were done like this one, I probably wouldn't have much problem with them, but sadly they're usually just random enemies thrown together purely to make the fight harder. Though there still is one duo fight that I think is better than this one, and it's by a lot, so we'll have to wait a while until we get to them. So be sure to keep watching for, let's see, like 4 more videos and we'll be getting pretty close. Okay, it's time to get sad. Sif is very much like Gwyndolin to me. The fight itself is very unremarkable. It's a pretty basic moveset, nothing crazy, but it does do the job. Where this fight truly shines is in its lore and design. Let's get the obvious out of the way. He's a giant wolf wielding a giant sword. That's pretty fucking badass. Even if it is a really basic concept, my god does it hit. But the part that carries the fight the hardest is by far the lore. I won't be going into too much detail as this isn't a lore video, but if you're even slightly interested in this game, please look up the lore video on Sif and or Artorias. It makes this fight hit way harder. Also, if you're the type of person that leaves Sif on low HP, then I hate you. Laurence is a bit like Parl or Dragonslayer armor for me. He's kind of a filler boss who isn't all that memorable. The only difference is that Laurence is a pretty major lore character. In terms of the lore, Laurence is a very interesting character with a lot to learn about, making it all the more of a shame that his fight is so forgettable. First off, his design is very reminiscent of the Cleric Beast. For lore reasons, this does make sense, which is why I'm fine with it, but I do think it still takes away from the potential of the fight. Though the similarity doesn't really end with only the design, as the movesets are also very similar. For the first phase, Laurence just feels like a souped up Cleric Beast. Where he really starts to distinguish himself is in the latter half of the fight. He'll lose his legs and start spewing lava, even leaving a trail as he crawls. This makes for a visually interesting fight, but he still feels very lacking to fight. There isn't really anything stopping you from just hugging him and spamming him down. I don't really know with Laurence, he's such a weird fight. FromSoft just really missed hard on Laurence in what is otherwise one of the best DLCs I've ever played. What a shame. Fire Giant is a weird one. I honestly have no idea where people stand on this one. Some people say they like it, while others despise it. Well, as you can see from the ranking, I'm pretty much somewhere in the middle. As far as fighting against giant enemies, I think Fire Giant does it pretty well. For once, the game doesn't straight up punish you for playing under them, which is the natural way to attack a giant enemy. There's a decent amount of attacks that are easy to read, with not a lot of them being extremely hard to dodge. The only thing that really drags this fight down for me is the fact that he loves to roll. For being such a big dude, he sure is agile, constantly rolling away. All this really does is extend a fight that is already pretty long, as the Fire Giant has a shit ton of HP. He also has one of the most brutal mid-fight cutscenes in any FromSoft game that genuinely made me feel bad for the guy for the first time I fought him. Though after roll number 352, I was feeling significantly less bad. And in comes the third contender for the worst opinion in this tier list, and this one pains me just as much as it pains you. I for the life of me tried to like this fight, but I just can't. First off, let me give you a disclaimer. I was using a greatsword for my playthrough, and I honestly think a lot of the problem stems from this, but let's get into the specifics. Let's start with what is probably my biggest problem. Maliketh is way too aggressive. He's basically always doing something. In his first phase, he barely has any openings. Most of his attacks will just end with him doing a backstep and swing his sword, or tossing a bunch of rocks at you. This is another major problem I have with him. He absolutely loves to create distance and just absolutely pelt you with range attacks. Something that becomes extremely tedious extremely fast. This doesn't really get any better in phase 2, where I swear he spends more time in the air than he does on the ground. Not that he's much better on the ground, as most of his moves just ends in a massive AoE around him, so you don't get that many chances to attack him then either. Don't get me wrong, I don't have a problem with waiting for openings in a boss's attack pattern, but it's just way too much with Maliketh. He's just constantly doing something, basically has no downtime, doesn't flinch with any attacks no matter the weapon. He honestly might be one of the best and most fun bosses if you fight him with a faster weapon that can attack without committing much. But from my experience with a great or ultra great sword, is one of the most frustrating fights that I've done in any of the Souls games. I genuinely think this is a massive shame, as Maliketh is one of my favorite bosses in the game, design and lore wise. I tried oh so hard to like him, but I can't forgive his gameplay being so frustrating, so the least I can do is place him at the top of the OK tier. I hope you can all find it in your hearts to forgive me for this horrible take. Well, look at the bright side. At least that should be the last of my absolute horrendous takes, so now you just need to tank through my moderately poor takes instead. I'm sorry Maliketh, hopefully I do you justice in the DLC. I'll be praying. Feels great to finally have done a tier that is somewhat positive. As before, I'll chuck it up on screen so you can see it in its entirety. I actually had a lot more fun making this video than the last one, so I managed to gather the motivation to complete it way faster. Hopefully, my takes weren't too spicy, but I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments how wrong I am anyways. Next up, we'll be having a look at the good tier, which is also the biggest tier in the list, so it might take a little bit longer than this one to come out. But I hope you're looking forward to it anyways. But that's about it. Thank you for watching, bye.